Yes, I thought that I would put together a color palette generator to help you in your process of learning React and Redux and all this other cool stuff that we're going to work with this summer. So you can see here's a color palette, and every time I press the space bar, we get a new color palette. The way that this is working is I generate two random colors, one for the right and one for the left, and then I just do a blend between those two colors to get the palette. So not very sophisticated, but kind of fun. And you get some really awful palettes and some decent palettes. So let's dive into the actual code side of this. Close some of these windows. Okay, so at the most basic level, this is a React app. So it starts with regular HTML, and there's not a whole lot here. The important part here is this div with the ID of root. So if we go to this index.js, we will see that we're importing React and importing a React DOM, and then we are rendering something to the React DOM. If you go look at here, this is saying it's getting the element by the root ID, or getting an element by ID and root. So in our HTML file, this root is what here in this index.js we're referring to. So this is where we're going to generate our React stuff. Alright, so you can see that what we are rendering is this provider, and then nested inside of it is this app. This provider has to do with Redux, and you don't need to understand it right now, but every React Redux application has a provider. But this app is where I want to focus. So you can look at this app. We could have named it anything we wanted, but if you look at it, this app is being imported from containers app. So if you look, we have a containers folder, and inside of that we have an app.js. So if I look at that, this is also importing React, and we're creating a new class app that extends component. This app is nothing, it's not a keyword, we get to choose the name of that. So that's that, and then it's returning every React class has a render function, and render is what it's going to put on the screen. So if I say this and say hello, you go look at this. There we go. I don't know why it took a second, but there's the hello. And this can take HTML elements, so if I had put that in h1 tags, then you can see then it's actually an h1 div. And if we go look here and inspected the DOM, you would see that we have our div, and then inside of that we have the hello. So if we look at the React app, you'll see that the class name here is app, and then hello. If we look here at the inspector, we have a div with a class of app and hello. Alright, let's go ahead and put this back. So palette, what is palette? Well, if we look, palette is imported from down a folder components palette. So we are right now here in containers.app. So if we go down a folder, that would put us in source, and then components, and then palette.js. So we are here. Alright, so this has a lot more code here, but if you look at this line, we have a class that's a palette, and then let's ignore this component did mount and just focus here on this render. So let's again do this and say inside the palette. And now if we go back here to the screen, oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing. Okay, so I forgot to save this app.js, so let's save that. It was still thinking it was doing the hello thing. There we go, inside the palette. Okay, so put this back, and we'll see all of our beautiful colors again. So let's break this down and see what's going on. I am saying palette.map. So palette is an array of strings, and I'm mapping over that. So the way that map functions work is it gives you back, in this case, so map takes a function, and this is ES6, the way you write anonymous functions or lambda functions, but really you could also do function, and then these two are just the parameters the function's receiving, and then this is like the function body down here, like that. So that's the old way of writing JavaScript, where map, it takes a function, and that function returns what you're turning the map into, or the array items into. But I'm going to go back to the ES6 syntax, but that's what these are. So this whole thing is a function, and it's taking two parameters, which is color and I, and we're taking a color, and what we're going to pass back is a color block. And if we look at color block, we can see that we're importing color block from this color block. So the / just means the folder that we're currently in. So we're in the components folder, so we're looking at this color block. Okay, so let's go look at that. Well, first thing before we do that, notice that we're saying this color equals color, and basically we're passing that color in what React has is this .props. So what we pass here shows up inside of these blocks in this .props. So this is also ES6, and what this is saying is rather than doing like var color equals this .props color, we can just do this shorthand, which says from this .props pull out this color. And if we had another variable that we were passing in this .props, we could do this like color and width. And then color and width are just two variables now that we can use. So you'll see that I create a new variable that uses this color, and it's going to tell us, we're just running a Boolean function to say, is this dark? Is this color dark or not? And based on that, we're going to use that information. So if I go back to palette, and let's say color, if I just change this to a red, and look at our code, you'll see that I have a block of red, and that's because now every palette is red. So that's not very exciting. So let's change it back to color. Alright, so where is this palette coming from? Well, before we do that, we could just define it right here and say const palette equals, and then we could give it colors. So let's give it 3 colors. These colors are going to look awful together. Alright, so we're going to use this palette. So instead of using palette, we're going to use this underscore palette. And go look at that. And now we have 3 colors. We have our red, green, and blue. So there's nothing special with what this palette is right here. It's just an array that looks like this. But where is it coming from? Well, another place we could make it come from is every component can have a state, an internal state. So we'll create a constructor for this and say this.state equals, and then we could define a palette here. You could say red and blue. Okay, and then down here in our render function, we could say const, rather than getting this palette from props, we could get it from the state, this dot state. And now when we save, palette is not defined because we're not using underscore anymore, we're using palette. So there we go. So now we have our red and our blue. And alright, so that's how that works. So now we're going to take a look at this component did mount. This function is called one time, it's called every time the component is initially rendered to the screen. So in our case, that's only going to get called once because the palette never gets removed from the screen, it just gets put on. So if we ever removed the palette from the screen, that would call another function that we could use called component will unmount. And we could run some custom logic in here, and then when it remounted, this would get called again. But our palette never gets unmounted, so the mount will only get called once. Alright, so this is using a little jQuery, which says when a key is pressed down, then we get the event for that. And this is saying what we're trying to figure out what is focused right now. So if we had like clicked in an input and we were typing in like our password or something, this tag would tell us that the element that is focused is an input element or a text area. So we don't really need this in our program because this is just saying if we're in an input, then we don't want to capture that keystroke. But if we're not, then we would hit here. And now e.which will tell us which the key code for what got pressed. Well, the key code for spacebar is 32. So if the spacebar was pressed, then we're going to generate a random palette, and then we're doing this thing called this.props.setPalette. But notice right now how we're using the palette from the state. So what we could do is we could do this.setState, and it takes an object. So we're going to update the palette, and we're going to give it this new palette that we got from the random generator. Double slash just makes this a comment. Alright, so now what happens is we go back here, and now when I hit spacebar, we're going to get a new random palette. Ooh, that one looks nice. Okay, so it seems like this is working just as well as what I showed you when we first started this video, and that's true. This works really well. And if our app was as simple as this one, then we could stop there. Now, Redux is something that helps React maintain state, or I guess it moves the state outside of the components. So right now we're holding the palette state inside of this palette component, but if say we wanted to use that information somewhere else, it would be difficult for another component to know what the palette is because it's inside of this particular palette component. So we don't really want to do that. We want to make this information available to any component that wants it. And so the way we can do that is with Redux. So Redux takes a little bit of code, but it is worth it, and we'll be using it somewhere on our project. So let's change this so that it's not using the internal state, it's using the Redux to hold the state. And Redux is basically it's basically just like a global state. So there's nothing really fancy going on there. It's just moving it outside the components. Alright, so let's go look at this Redux stuff. So here there's a folder called core, and inside of core there's a reducer. The important thing to notice here is that we have a object in these curly braces that has a key called UI, and it takes a UI reducer. And if I go look at this UI folder in core and look at the reducer here, now we can see that there's a state that has a palette, and this UI reducer takes a couple of functions. Well, you can see that it matches a couple of cases. So one thing it does is set palette, and if we're calling a function called set palette, the thing we're going to do is we're going to take the current state, which is the current state of this reducer, and we're going to override the palette key. So this reducer only has one key in it, but let's say that we had another thing in here like modal open. So when we do this, we would override this key, but modal open would maintain its value. But again, simple, we only need one. It has this second thing that it matches for, which is set color. And this one looks a little bit fancier, and actually I don't use it in the current program, but this one will allow you to, rather than changing out the whole palette, you could pass in a color, so payload.color, and you could pass in an index, and so it would just replace a single color in the palette. And this is just fancy things. This is fancy JavaScript for, here's a square bracket, which means we're creating an array. It says take everything, first off we're doing state.palette.slice from 0 to payload index. So let's say the index is 2. So the palette has 5 colors in it. We're slicing from 0 to 2, so that's going to go grab these colors, 0 to 2. And so we grab those 3 colors, then we're going to add our payload color. So we would go, well, so we have the 3 colors we grabbed, we're going to add this new color, and then we're going to go get index plus 1, so that would be 4, so we're going to go start slicing at 4, which is here. So you'll notice that we grab the first 3, we input our new color, and then we grab the last 4, and so we leave out this and replace it with a different one. So that's what this is doing. This is a common pattern you do. Right. So that's the reducer here, and with Redux you explicitly define what kind of actions can be performed on this reducer, and they map very much to these types. So if we go look at the actions that we can perform, you'll see that we are 2 actions, a set palette and a set color. And when we call set palette, it expects us to pass a palette, and the way that this function is going to map to this reducer is, you'll notice that this is looking for types.setPalette, and here in this actions we're saying that type is types.setPalette, and what we're passing is as the payload is the palette. So when we look at this reducer, when it matches this types.setPalette, you'll notice that this payload is getting assigned to palette, and that's perfect because that's what we want. Now if we look at this set color function, it takes 2 parameters, color and index, and we're passing the, oh, that's a mistake, this is supposed to say types.setColor. It's passing as the payload an object that has a color in it and an index. So this is a fancy way of writing color, so this is the key. and this is the value. But if the key and the value have the same name, you can just shorthand it like this. And some of this is fancy. The reason that I guess I am leaving this fancy stuff in here is because I've used it in the code base for the stuff we're working on this summer, and so it will increase the complexity, but you guys are smart and you'll figure it out, and you'll like it when you figure it out. Okay, so that's that. So let's go back to this palette component. So you notice here in this folder, we're in the component. This is the thing that's rendering to the screen those color blocks. Alright. First thing, notice is that we are importing get palette and set palette from core.ui. So from this core.ui, we are importing this function set palette, and here in this selector we are importing the get palette. And if you look at get palette, what's happening here is when we call get palette, we're going to call get UI state, which is this function here, which is getting, it's just returning state.ui. So this is going to get replaced with state.ui, and then from that we're grabbing the palette. Well, where does that come from? Well, if you remember back here in this root reducer, the key for this UI reducer is UI. So in this selector, that's where this state.ui comes from. Is state is actually referring to this whole object right here. If we had other reducers, they'd show up in here, but we only have one reducer for this particular app. And the selector is just getting that reducer, and we're returning the palette from it. So back in this palette component, in order to hook up these values to our component, we have to do this common pattern, which is we create a new variable called const map state to props. So we're taking the state and mapping it to the props that we're going to pass inside to this render component. And we're creating a new selector, which you can understand this, but the pattern is, the pattern is the same every time. So you pass in the selectors, which is the get palette, whatever that returns. So if we actually had another function called get width, then here in this function, you'll notice that this is the same syntax that we had before that we saw up here in this map. This is the function parameters, and then this arrow bracket lets us know it's a anonymous inline function, and this is the function body. So this function, I'm just going to write it out one time so you can see what this is actually doing. So this is the same thing as function palette returns an object palette. So this is equivalent to this. So this function palette is basically mapping to this, and then we are, the shorthand for saying return an object is parentheses curly brace palette. So looks nice and clean, but maybe very confusing. But this is the same thing as this. Okay. So we have this map state to props, and if we go back to look at this app.js, we're exporting a default app, and that's what allows us to, whatever you export as the default, is here in this index.js, it allows us to import that. So in order to import something, we have to export it. So we're exporting this app. Well, here in this palette, it looks more complicated because we're exporting default, and we're not exporting the palette, we're exporting this whole thing, which is we are connecting, and this is all Redux stuff here. Connect, we're mapping the state to props, and the map dispatch to props. Here in this map dispatch to props, all we're doing is creating an object, and it has in it a this function set palette, and then we're exporting the palette. So basically what this is doing is making it so that the same way that to this color block we're passing in color and color, and if we go look at the color block, you will see that this dot props is where we're getting color from. Well, this connector is allowing us to get these variables here, this palette and this set palette, inside of our component. So now, because we did that, we have this dot props dot set palette. We could call this function, and we have this dot props dot palette from here. So, and again, the shorthand for pulling that out of an object is, so this line, well, so if I had done const set palette equals this dot props dot set palette like this, these two lines are happening in one line right here. So this one line is doing exactly what these two lines are doing. Well, in this render function, we don't actually use the set palette, we just get the palette. And that palette is what is in here in this state. That's how we're getting access to it. Alrighty, and then we're mapping all those values. You'll notice that in the component.mid-mount, when we hit the spacebar, this is where we could have done this again, the const set palette equals this dot props and set palette that is doing the same thing as this. So this time I chose not to pull it out of the props and just call it directly from the props. This generate random palette is, you'll notice it's not anywhere in here, this file, and that's because we are importing it from go down a folder, core utils. So here we're in components, go down a folder to source, go to core, and then go to utils. And here this index.js, you'll notice that we have a function called generate random palette, and that's where we're exporting it. So that's where that function's coming. This isn't doing anything that fancy. We're importing a library. Notice that this doesn't have like a period and a slash, which would say look in this folder for this. If it doesn't have that, it means it's a library or an npm module that we're using. So yeah, like a lot of projects, we use other people's open source code to simplify, so we don't have to do everything ourselves. And TinyColor is just a small package that helps us work with colors. So we're importing this, and we're saying tinycolor.random. That gives us a random color, so that's color 1, and same thing for color 2. And then we're creating this palette, which is going to have 5 colors. First one is simply the random color, and we're converting it to a hex string. The last one is color 2 to a hex string. And then you'll notice in the middle we're mixing color 1 with color 2, 25%, and then 50%, and then 75%. So that's how we're generating the palette. All right. And honestly, I think that's everything I wanted to show you. My guess is your head is spinning, and you have lots of questions. And where's that get with? So you'll see here, it says that there's an error in components palette, and it's on line 48. So let's go look at component palette. That's the file we're in, and on line 48 it says, oh, I don't know what this get width function is. It does know what get palette is because we imported it here, but it doesn't know about the get width because I made it up. So let's get rid of that. Go back here, and all is happy and well. So hopefully this is helpful. Again, I don't expect you to understand all of this to start with, but hopefully based on what the tutorials that I sent you and you're listening to, watching and reading, that some of this will help. And also I will send you a link to the GitHub repository so you can see the actual code and play with it yourself. But yeah, feel free to shoot me questions. I am happy to help and answer more. Alright, see ya.